Hello, I am Cooper-Hewitt, Chair of the Department of Architecture and Urban Design, and I have to apologize for the coldness of this place. We made a complaint about the plumbing issue last April, but it takes, I guess it's very complicated, so it's taking still time, and we hope to fix this by the end of the year, so please bear. I'm so sorry. But there will be another lecture on November 6th by Viennese young office, Propeller Z, and please come to join us. And hopefully by that time we have a heating issue fixed. It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening, Michael Maltzan, and I am so glad that to make an announcement that he won this big competition for the 6th Street Bridge Viaduct. And it's a very, very interesting scheme, which was so different from other proposals, like turning sort of monument into more like an environment. And I can't wait to see when it happens. Congratulations. Since founding MF Michael Maltzan Architect in 1995, Michael Maltzan, FAIA, has created practice which engages the increasingly complex reality of urbanism and information-driven culture, charting a new trajectory for architecture and the public realm. Building on his background in the arts, his work synthesizes the ambiguity of our contemporary world through architecture that is catalyst for new experience and agent for change. Through shared belief in architecture's role in our cities, this work from MOMA to Skid Row creates new connections across a range of scales and programs. His work has been recognized with numerous accolades, including 5 Progressive Architecture Awards, 22 citations from the American Institute of Architects, the Rudy Bruner Foundation's Gold Medal for Urban Excellence, and as a finalist for the Smithsonian Cooper-Hewitt Museum's National Design Award. His designs have been featured in over 100 national and international publications. So it is our honor to welcome him, and please join me in welcoming Michael Maltzan.
Thank you, Hitoshi. Just going to take a second to. Thank you. Even on a cold night, no heat, not so bad actually. I appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. Tonight, I want to talk about a range of our projects, and mostly recent projects. But what's even more so been on my mind, and as I was preparing the talk tonight, was the complexity, not so much of describing any one of the projects, but really the group of projects that I want to talk about, the group of primarily more recent projects that I want to talk about. Because increasingly, it's difficult to tell a singular story about the projects. The projects that we're involved in are not so much traditionally connected to architecture. It seems like, either by their scale, their typology, their setting, their ambition, their function. And this dilemma of the projects and the types of projects and the variety of projects, the range of projects, is also a dilemma that we're quite excited about in the office, because it allows us to begin to explore something that we talk a great deal about in the office, which is the potential elasticity in architecture to cover a wider range of cultural, social, aesthetic, political conversations. And that while form is important in the work, the form of practice is is increasingly perhaps what's really at stake in an even greater project. And that the reality of these projects, some of them projects that we've received by design, some of them just by luck. And given these projects, that increasingly the unconventional reality of these project types, in the way I've been thinking about them, isn't so much specific to our individual practice, but potentially really more of an indication of the type of work that architecture increasingly is going to be involved in. And if that's the case, it seems that it's increasingly a potential place, a potential space for architecture to seize. In trying to figure out how to put these projects together, I've defaulted to a very logical process. I'm going to start with the conventional, maybe, and go to projects that maybe are less traditionally architecturally. And what I'd very much like to do first is to start with a house. A number of years ago, we were approached by two painters, Larry Pittman and Roy Dow. Larry's on the faculty here at UCLA in the painting department, but both who have significant painting careers, both teachers, but exhibit nationally, internationally. And it was to develop a new house for them that was adjacent to an existing Neutra house that they had in La Crescenta. La Crescenta is a suburb really built in the 60s and the 70s in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. And when the Neutra house, which is here up on the mountain, was originally built, the Cyrilnik house, much of all of this didn't exist. It was a kind of incredibly bucolic landscape that the house was built on, about 10 acres of land, in a sense isolated in this quite rugged but very beautiful set of foothills in the mountains. You arrived to the house up a long road that went to the Neutra house. But there is an additional flat area that they decided that they would build on. And when Neutra first developed this property with the Cyrilniks, Mrs. Cyrilnik was for many years Neutra's assistant, he convinced them to also cut a series of other flat pads in the mountains. There's one down in the lower part of the canyon, and then this site here. They never did do anything with it. And our clients, Larry and Roy, bought the property. They were the second owners, and for many years lived in the Neutra house with no real issues. They had no sense that they were going to build a new house. As you approached the new house, though, up that road, that sense of approach, that sense of movement, that sense of spiraling up the hill led to, in many ways, the form or the experience of the form of the house, which is a seven-sided house, in which the house almost seems to be moving with you or spinning with you. You can never, as an odd-sided figure, you can never quite understand the symmetry, and because of that, it gives you the sense that you haven't ever quite understood the full form of the house. You come up along the side of the road, the house seems to be perched on a rock, almost spinning off of that rock. The landscape itself is almost tundra-like. You really get the sense that you're at the top of the mountain. The house is quite opaque on the exterior, and then finally into the entry court, where there is a small carport, which is similar to the Neutra house, which sits up here in a extremely privileged, somewhat parental position, looking down at our project, which I was very conscious of. And there's also this very beautiful, iconic stone pine, which plays into the form of the house as a whole. You finally, again, arrive in the carport and continue along what is, for the most part, a clockwise spiral all the way into the house. That unfolding sense of movement is very much spatially what animates the house on both the exterior as well as the interior form. Now, one of the things that struck me from the beginning was this relationship to the Neutra house. They were going to keep the Neutra, they have kept the Neutra house, using it primarily as a guest house and a library. In a way, the Neutra house has this incredibly romantic idea of modernism, completely transparent for the most part around the exterior, phenomenal views and sense of connection between the inside and the outside of that house was something that they very much continued in their development of the landscape. Larry and Roy developing one of the flat pads into a very beautiful succulent garden, which was really a partner of the ceramic house during the time that the first 10 years that they were living in the house. But over time, that transparency and the lightness of the Neutra house, the sense that in a way it was cold, and it also meant that it was cold inside, the winds blow through the mountains, the house was built in that post-war sense of lightness. It's single glazed, very large pieces of glass. The house rattles, it seems to move and shake and sway in the weather. That was something that started to very much become an issue for them over time. That romantic sense of, or that modernist sense was something that was becoming more and more complex to live with. And in reality, that landscape. Here you see down our house with the large stone pine, that kind of bucolic sense of the far-off vista of the valley. But in fact, that landscape is a very intense one, obviously. This was taken by right during the major fires a few years ago, where the flames were coming just over the hill. They were put out at the last minute. We were about 2 months from finishing construction. That idea of starting to become more, at the very least, ambivalent about the relationship between inside and outside, transparency between the Neutra house and the outside, was something that was fundamental to our conversations about the house. But over time, in the conversations from a design standpoint, one of the things that became very clear was it wasn't just an environmental sense of transparency that was becoming more and more of an issue, that it was a larger cultural issue, that this sense of always being connected culturally, whether it was because of their work, because of the way they showed, because of being connected digitally, which is a phenomena that is not different than any of us are experiencing, became really the conversation about the house. The sense that to be simultaneous, to be completely connected all of the time, to never have, in a sense, a private life, was really what was potentially at stake in the design of the house. And that was interesting because that had much larger concern architecturally, spatially, and I would even go so far as to say that potentially this problem of simultaneity is maybe the greatest spatial challenge that I think we face as architects, as designers at this point. How do we begin to move the typologies and the models and the spatial models to deal with the reality of that? In this house, we started to, I got very interested as an aside in the something called mathematical dissections, and this is not generally the way that I approach work, but these were quite interesting, where mathematicians really playing as a game take evenly sided figures and dissect them geometrically and then recombine them so they become other even-sided figures. So a square can become a 6 or 7-sided figure. What was more important for me was almost the way that these diagrams could act metaphorically, that they could be an inversion it was a way of approaching an inversion of the Neutra house, that you took that pure geometry of the rectangle and began to slice it apart and turn it literally inside out, so that the opacity at the center of that house started to form the exterior walls, and the transparency no longer became the outer perimeter of the house, but started to be moved to the inside of the house, so that the opacity surrounded and enveloped the house, and all of your views, all of the sense of real presence between multiple spaces happened on the inside of the house, so that the spaces on the inside of the house were completely interconnected. There are moments in the house, as you move around it, in which there are very particular and calibrated views to the surrounding landscape. The house may feel to at a certain level as if it's spinning, but there are also moments where you can really take your bearing. And in some cases, they look at certain iconic elements, like the big stone pine, that is the landscape connection between the Neutra house and the new house. But more often than not, the sense of spatial condition inside the house is one in which multiple spaces are understood all at the same time. So whether it's the library, the bedroom, and the bathroom, or the passageway, the bedroom, the outside courtyard, the living room, and the space beyond, these spatial shish kebabs in which all of those spaces are present at the same time is much more characteristic of the house, and starts to become hopefully the quality of the house, the spatial quality of the house, as opposed to the challenge that the Neutra house was becoming at both an environmental and a cultural level. A number of years ago, one of the very first projects that I worked on, it was really the start of the office, was a project for a school of inner city arts. I'm not really going to talk about it tonight. It was an important project for me. It's here. It's a nonprofit school for children in the LA Unified School District, primarily in this area of Skid Row, in the factory district, immediately approximate to downtown. I think this image, I love this image of Elon Bonds, because I think it tells you as much about the city as it does about the building itself. But what's important about this, and why it relates to some of the other projects I want to talk about, is that the real question here was that whether, in my mind, architecture could even exist in this kind of context, in this kind of place. Could architecture in a way stretch enough and be elastic enough to have a real presence in a place that most people considered completely anonymous, was an unlikely context for work of this kind to take place. And that led, as a project, to a group of projects that we've been involved in for probably the last 10 years, which are housing projects for a group called the Skid Row Housing Trust. And the trust originally was set up primarily to build housing, really as transitional hotels for homeless individuals to come off the street for a few nights. The social project of that was working at some level, but it was very limited. What they found was that most times people would move back onto the streets, back into Skid Row, and so there was this endless shuttling or cycling for most of those individuals. They approached us to design the first project, which was called, or is called, Rainbow Apartments. And the model, in the way that the model was changing, was moving from these small hotel-sized units to truly permanent housing. You could live here for the rest of your life. It was an apartment unit. But the other thing that was important was that there were other functions that were brought into the project that they were not equipped to really handle, and that included a lot of the social services and supportive services, so that these buildings took on the responsibility of not being just about housing, but truly being, in a sense, these microcosms of people's entire lives, that they were very much the heart of a particular community. Now, housing partially out of these projects, but also out of a real interest. This is the office, a satellite view of the office. Housing is for us, a type of project that has become completely intertwined with the work as a whole. And very often, this work is described in our larger, in our practice, as being our socially motivated or socially conscious work, as if the rest of the work that we were doing wasn't somehow. And that has always been something that is kind of pissed me off. It's been a little bit infuriating because we don't look at the work as being separate. And in a way, if you do, then you start to automatically start to create different silos in which architecture is either able to or not able to exist. And I think one of the projects here is to see if it can exist more holistically with the work and the practice as a whole. And the reason I use this image is because these are all of the projects going on at the same time, but the housing projects, which are here and over here and actually over here, aren't relegated to one place in the office, but to give you an indication that they are in fact more thoroughly intertwined with the office as a whole. I think that housing is so important because the typology of housing, which absolutely is at the core of a larger pantheon of modernist housing or modernist typologies, continues to be a really vital type to explore, especially in a city like Los Angeles, which has had so little of it. Certainly it developed in more recently when you look at the full breadth of housing developed in the city. And housing has the potential, in my mind, to stand in for many of the same, it coalesces many of the same mechanisms and imaginations that exist in cities and urbanism as a whole. And so the goal here is certainly to design singular buildings, but a big part of it as well is to approach these projects and to think of them really as microcosms of urbanism in general, and whether that relationship, the part to a whole relationship in urbanism, especially in a city like Los Angeles, allows you to begin to explore some of the complex emergences in urbanism in a city like LA, contemporary cities in general. After Rainbow Apartments, we were asked to do a second one. Well, we actually asked to do a second one. It seemed that most people would do one and then would not do any others. And there's such a learning curve in doing these projects that it seemed essential to try to do multiple of these buildings. So again, the project was not an individual building, but all of the projects as a whole. The second project, Carver Apartments, is 97 units. And at this point, the Housing Trust was looking to move some of these projects outside of Skid Row, to stop balkanizing the issue to one particular district in the city, to stop siloizing the problem in one district, and to look for something that was much more visible, which I think they found. This is the 10 freeway. We're about 20 feet away from one of the on-ramps and off-ramps to the 10 freeway. The 110 is right here. Staples Center, LA Live is immediately adjacent. It sits right on Hope Street. Ironically, is the end of, it's the terminus of Hope Street. One of the challenges of this project was its very much its relationship to the highway at some very pragmatic levels. One was acoustic. To deal with this project acoustically was intense. It's one of the reasons why the windows are smaller, had to be intensely developed from an engineering standpoint. They're like airport class. The round shape started to begin to deal with that acoustically. It presented the smallest face in proximity to the highway, to the noise generating surfaces as possible. I was also fascinated by this problem we were having, a kind of arcane problem of building these projects, which was trying to minimize surface area, exterior surface area, which was the most expensive part of building the projects, to the interior space, creating the most space. And a circle allows you to create the most floor area to the smallest amount of surface area. At least that's the way we started. But there was also a real ambition in this project to take advantage of this connection to the visibility of the site. That making a building that in a sense didn't shrink from its responsibility to be present, maybe not iconic, but to be present in the city, and to have a strong formal role to the community that passed by on the highway constantly, was also fundamental to the project. This gives you a sense, I won't do this to you too many times, but it gives you a sense when the traffic is actually moving, how the building seems to almost begin to, in a very staccato fashion, spin with you, so that the form of the building starts to be in a stronger relationship, movement relationship, visual relationship to the people passing by the 10 freeway. The ground floor of this project is very different than the way that the rest of the scheme was laid out. The ground floor has many of the public spaces, but for me is part of the project that tries to have a stronger relationship to the underneath of the highway. And this question of infrastructure and the role of infrastructure as really a singular or a monoculture that for the most part elements in the city like the highway only do one thing and throw away so much of the other space in and around it was on my mind as we were doing this project. And I was trying to see if there wasn't some way of at least insinuating, we couldn't take over that space literally, but in some way of making the building insinuate that there were potential and real relationships to the streets, the alleys, but the underneath of the highway as well. So the whole ground floor of the building is made in the same way. It's made out of concrete. There are a series of axes which cut through the building that create visible, and when the building's more open, physical relationships through the building. You can see this is the resultant plan of those view quarters or skewerings through the building that begin to form the plan. There are a lot of the social services along this corridor leading into large community kitchen, community room, outside space. As you move up into the building, as soon as you get above that floor, the form starts to become much more related to the exterior drum form of the building. It's an unfolding or shell-like spiraling of a series of trapezoidal units, all exactly the same by necessity, but serrated in such a way that they start to create small pieces of space that relate to each of those units. Each one is an efficiency apartment, kitchen, bathrooms in the middle, and then living areas. These are the smallest of all of the units we've developed for the Housing Trust. In Rainbow, and also in this project, the courtyard was absolutely important as the heart of what could potentially be the community space. Here it was more challenging because the amount of space that we had was so much smaller, and potentially by being such a tight space, you could imagine it becoming almost like a panopticon, that the amount of intense surveillance that could take place in that space written into the form of the building could be problematic. One of the ways of starting to deal with that were these long fins that surround the entire space. They act as blinders. You can see directly across the space, but they begin to create much more visual disconnection or opacity immediately adjacent to you. They're quite effective in that way, and also become part of the overall building systems. This is looking up through that space, where the opening allows for a varied space over the course of the day as light changes, the sky changes quite intensely as you look up through that aperture, and allows you a strong sense of connection to the outside, even though it's isolated from the sound. Differently than the first project, Rainbow, which had most of the public services in one floor, in this project they begin to spiral up so that they're more evenly distributed vertically. One of the most important spaces is the community. There's a community room that has the laundry room attached, very prosaic functions in the building, but they're placed exactly at the same level as the raised highway, more or less on the third floor, so that the building in sections starts to at least try to create a much stronger series of connections between, again, the community that's constantly passing by on the highway and the community that often is very anonymous in these buildings. The space becomes a kind of front porch, and specifically, and definitely when the traffic during rush hour is slower and stopped, there is a very intense set of relationships that take place between people in that space and who is watching and who is being watched between those two spaces. The third of these projects that's in construction right now is the Star Apartments. Star Apartments is back for the most part on Skid Row, on the corner of 6th and Maple Street. Rainbow Apartments, the first one I showed you, was here. Julie and Hank Koenig-Eisenberg, this is a little bit before that, this photograph, but did a project, the alley right next to that, a couple of years ago. This is in close proximity to many of the missions, but here the idea has changed again, it's evolved again with the Trust, who have been looking for years to again create more complexity in these buildings, moving away from projects that are just housing to projects that engage the city in a deeper way, and to look at trying to do mixed-use projects. But there's a problem, which is that given the way that the funding happens on these projects, the rules that come along with the money, you're not allowed to be in anything but the housing business. If you're in the housing business, that's what you're meant to be producing. You're not allowed to do other types of projects. But eventually, the Trust found a loophole in those regulations that said if you had bought a project that had retail or some other use, or you already owned one of those projects, that you could keep that use. So they went out looking for a commercial building, and they found this building, which is the ground floor, will be the ground floor of our project. We're changing it some, but it's a quintessentially Los Angeles building. It's a one-story concrete deck building, parking on top right now, stucco exterior of the building, no parking underneath, storefront all around. This is interesting at a lot of levels. I think, one, because of what the Trust is trying to do, but I also think that one of the challenges in contemporary cities, and especially in a city like Los Angeles, is the reality that density is starting to change the city, is starting to change the equation of the city. And that's happening for a lot of reasons, but you can begin to see that happening in places like downtown. And it's not so much that downtown is really the center of the city. I think that conversation is long past. It doesn't matter that it is. It isn't. It has other characteristics. But you can see density starting to have an effect on this part of the city. And I think the real challenge for a place like Los Angeles is how to invent that, the response to that, in ways that are uniquely related to Los Angeles, that deal with a lot of the underpinnings of the way in which this city has continued to evolve, as opposed to importing other models from more traditional cities. And imagining that you would heap a building like this as opposed to scraping the site is fascinating to me, because I think it at least indicates that increasingly strong or visible conversation in the city. To continue to keep those businesses open as long as possible, which is a part of the regulations of allowing this to be mixed use, we had to find a way to build the building so that that ground floor stayed as intact as possible. And we started to develop a scheme in which we are needling down through this structure with new structure, missing most of the retail units, and then building a new tray, a concrete tray up above that, and then placing the new units, all of the residential units, on top of that tray. It creates a whole set of complexities, but one of the things that I think is very interesting urbanistically, here you see just a diagram of the way that that's starting to be developed, the tray, the different units which are all prefabricated and stacked on that tray, an interior seismic structure that allows for the building to perform horizontally in the tray. But what has become very interesting to me about this project is that, again, this idea of a building being a kind of potential overlay or condensation of different urban impulses, I think, is very present here. So you have the ground floor retail mixed use, this middle space, which starts to become a horizontal public and semi-public space, and then the units in this intense density up above. That middle space has many different functions. Basketball court, there's a jogging track, community kitchen, laundry room, computer room, community garden, all on that horizontal plane with views out to the city. Then the units themselves are in a kind of hyperdensity. There's no real courtyard here. These are stacking diagrams. This even gets more filled in, so that the idea of the density is even more intense than you would ever find in a city like Los Angeles. And the collaging of this into a type of Neapolitan sandwich in which each of those components seems quite distinct but are absolutely interrelated vertically, is making a very peculiar but I think kind of interesting project. We are doing the housing units in a prefabricated way. It's the first multifamily prefabricated building that's been built in Los Angeles in 40 years. There are a lot of reasons why it hasn't been possible, but I think in this, part of the work of the practice was to find a way with the city to allow it to take place. This is just to say that it's in construction. These are the units in Idaho. They complete about 4 units a day. They go on a truck. Actually, they're on a truck. They're going to start stacking in about a week, and the entire stack happens in about a month, which is really incredible. There are a lot of ways to discuss why that makes so much sense. I'm not going to get into it so much right now. Maybe we can in the questions. But as a whole, each of these small projects, whether it's Carver, Rainbow, Star Apartments, some of the other projects that we've been doing iteratively around the city, I think that these projects and the way in which, in my mind, they have the potential to be connected, to begin to think of all of these projects as a more interconnected project as a whole, is a different way of approaching large-scale change in the city. Most times we think that projects like LA Live, that have a huge gravitational presence in the city, are the way to transform in a positive way, in a progressive way, cities. And maybe that's true. But I also think that there's another way for architects to approach the city in a more temporal way, in a more iterative way, in which the impact starts to be built up over time, responds to the city over time, and has just as great, if maybe not even greater, ability to remap the city because of the connections that get made between those projects in a very real sense of ongoing relationship to the life of a particular city. That idea of creating a more interconnected set of temporal itineraries, urbanistically, a more temporal set of choreographies in larger urban situations is interesting. But I've also been continuing to look and think about whether it's possible to do that in one project, whether it even makes sense to try to do that in one project. And a couple of years ago, we were asked to do a project, a park project, as landscape architects, or as architects doing landscape architecture in Playa Vista. Immediately adjacent, the major part of Playa Vista, all the housing is happening here. The Spruce Goose, the hangar, is over here. This is part of a larger office development at the far eastern end of Playa Vista. And we were originally hired to do 2 buildings by Tishman Speyer, speculative office buildings, on the corner. And that was 2008. They asked us to do the project. I think it was on a Friday. The economy ended over the weekend. On Monday, the projects disappeared. But because of these other projects, the park was going to be built, and they asked us over a series of conversations if we were interested in being involved in the park. I was, because in a way the park here, I believed, had I don't know if it had a catalytic relationship to the way development might happen over time in this part of Playa Vista, but it would be pretty much one of the first things. So it would at least characterize the way that development would take place. I was thinking, we approached this project not so much as a park to be looked at by the buildings that surrounded the park, but really to be an extension of activities, a more 24-hour campus. The types of buildings, the type of culture they were trying to build here, which revolved around a lot of entertainment businesses, meant that people were going to be working here in the same way that you work here in architecture school. That your relationship between your work, between your life, between your social life was not distinct. It was all folded into one. And so that the park might become more of a bento box of activities, a kind of condensation again of larger social activities into one space. The park itself creates a series of what appear to be bridges across from one side to another, allowing connections to be made from one side of the campus to another. There's also a long linear pathway that actually relates to one of the original runways on this site when it was Hughes Aircraft. But again, each of these bridges has a very different function. It starts on the east side with a series of horticultural garden where you can take horticultural classes on the bridge. There's a smaller shade bridge which has a lot of smaller individual, more intimate activities. There's larger performance band shell and amphitheater space for large community gatherings. Courts, bridges with basketball, beach volleyball, children's playground, the lawn sports where there's soccer and a series of other lawn activities, and then a bridge that is in phase 2, which is a meeting bridge that will have Wi-Fi and connectivity in the bridge itself. Each of these zones or precincts has its own specific identity. And it's the collection of them and the relationship over time of experiencing these gardens that I think starts to produce a more cohesive, this is the horticultural bridges, a more cohesive possibility for identity. In a way, because I wasn't a landscape architect, I could step with freedom over the full history of history of landscape architecture. Or felt like that. And I was interested in the connection of the formality of the French garden, the kind of garden of the mind in its formal structures, being connected in a way with the English picturesque garden, the garden of the body, the garden of experience. And it seemed like the right way of starting to meld the potential for those two different experience types in one garden. These are just some of the views. Just one note: the bandshell, which really became the gathering point, the lantern in the project as a whole, was very much a structural problem. It was meant to be made. It was made out of fabric cladding with a steel structure inside. I was trying to create a structure that felt like it had a more animate presence, a more animate form, as if the interior structure was in fact starting to create the figuration of the exterior form. And it was produced by thinking of the structure three separate rings, feeling as if they were all spiraling around or spinning off of one point, connecting that with a more three-dimensional space-like frame that held them up and then cladding the whole project. And here you see both the figuration that's created by the tautness over that frame, and also the sense that the amphitheater is like a top spinning and possibly off of that one back part of the amphitheater, creating the large proscenium out to the hill of the amphitheater beyond. And I like this photograph also because, in a sense, the park as having the ambition of creating a kind of urban equivalent to the complexity that you might find in a denser situation, is surrounded by the most suburban of realities. And even when the amphitheater is empty, the sense that these suburban houses are in the balcony watching down, waiting for the activity to take place, I think is very telling about that particular place. But the ground that needs to continue to be made up in the conversation of what a city, what a contemporary city like Los Angeles means, what it looks like in the future. We've been working on a project for a while at San Francisco State University, which is a building that is for the state university system, that is a very large project, about 300,000 square feet, a performing arts college that includes a series of performing arts spaces, but also a lot of teaching spaces. And the goal of the university here was to make a building that brought together the different disciplines, music, dance, drama, into one building, as opposed to being distributed around the school, because they're looking to try to create stronger interdisciplinary programming, which is something that many schools are increasingly becoming interested in, especially in the creative disciplines or the arts. It sits right at the edge of the campus, is in many ways a gateway into the campus on the edge of Lake Merced Park. It has many, many different functions as it relates to the campus as a whole. But the building, and our approach to the building was, I think, challenged just by the scale of the project. That given the number of different programmatic elements, the number of different types of project, everything from little 80 square foot rooms to a 1,200 seat theater and everything in between, meant that the approach, and at 300,000 square feet, that the building wasn't so much a singular or identifiable building in and of itself, but that it had to perform as maybe something else, not really landscape, but maybe more as an approach to making or thinking about a city as opposed to a building. That many of the formal mechanisms of controlling and choreographing and developing the project were more akin to the way that you would approach a larger urban plan. It starts to come out at the lower level. There are many of the smaller production spaces that are pushed into the ground, but there are a series of courtyards which ramp down, that bring light, that allow for those spaces to open up, and are extensions of the landscape park on this side all the way through the building so that you can move through the building without actually ever coming inside it. As you move up a little bit more to the campus level, many of the larger spaces, like the 1,200-seat theater, a 450-seat theater, a small amphitheater, start to become much more visible and maybe more figural within the larger volume of the building as a whole. Up further now to different larger recital spaces, concert space, black box theater, the courtyard's moving through the space. And then up at the roof where you begin to see, I think, the relationship of the figures, the larger programmatic spaces, the grain or the roof that covers the grain of the different smaller intensive pedagogical spaces, and the courtyards moving through them. Connecting all of those spaces horizontally is another idea that's related in many ways to the Playa Vista Park, that there is one single floor, a kind of datum floor, at the second level that connects all of those spaces across. And this is where the sense of true interconnection between these different disciplinary silos actually has the possibility to take place. In fact, we're trying to almost force people to move horizontally past and deep into the building so that they become, just through their transits in the building, more visually connected, more aware of the other programs that exist in the building. This is an image of the first phase. It will be built as 3 different phases, but you see that floor, some of the activity like lecture room, computer room, learning spaces, cafes, and how visible as the most transparent of all of the floors that is to the exterior in the 1,200-seat theater immediately behind that. This just gives you a sense of the relationship of those. Again, the complexity of the model and the form. And then the difference in each of the spaces here, each of the performance spaces had a completely different programmatic agenda, but also had a completely different aesthetic agenda in a way. They had a different role to perform. This is the music recital hall, which is for the most part a shoebox space in which all of the corners disappear, allow for light to come in during the day, allow for light, artificial light to infuse the space during the night, but also allow for people to move and seem to appear and disappear through the space because the doors are normally open. And so the space isn't just an interior concert hall or recital hall itself. It's almost performs the function of a kind of plaza that on a daily basis people seem to, again, emerge and disappear through. The largest of the spaces is the 1,200-seat theater, which is a more traditional opera-like theater, stacked balconies which produce the real advantage of bringing people very close, creating a real sense of intimacy for the audience. But as opposed to the normal hierarchical stacking of the opera house balconies, instead we're trying to reinforce this cultural idea, social idea in the building of much more interconnectivity and social relationship, where the balconies quite literally start to weave into each other and create much smaller, more intimate seating pods or seating areas. Has the advantage also of being able to scale the space. These spaces can be closed, curtained off when they're small. For instance, a student performance whose performer is not going to fill the entire 1,200 seats. You can begin to create the very real sense that the space is still filled even if it's 600 and 700, 800 people. We won a competition about a year ago for a project in Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, to design a new pier. There's a pier there now. It's outlived its life, the St. Petersburg Pier. It's the thing they all point to and say, this is what represents our city. It's the thing that during the World Series, the Goodyear blimp always takes a picture of. It's always lit up out over the water. It has also become the place where, as opposed to any specific public space in the city, many of the most important social events, civic events in the city seem to take place. And that's fascinating as a project, because what they're really asking for, what the project is really about, is trying to create a kind of public park or public space, public realm out over the water, to create the equivalent of the public piazza, public plaza that we normally see in the city, out over the water, which is also, it seems, very real, because the entire reason for this city is in fact its relationship to the bay. The other thing that is constantly a part of the conversation about this project, which you see in many civic projects increasingly, is the ambition for this project to be an icon. That's a term that you hear all the time, that this is meant to be an icon for the city. And I think that is an enormous question for architecture. What constitutes this idea of an icon? How do you produce that? Is it even reasonable to assume that you can produce that? We started with two ideas, two impulses. One is that the typical pier, you come out, you come to the end of the pier, you turn around and you go back. That's the entire experience of the pier. Instead here, I was much more interested in trying to develop a pier in which there's a loop that creates a more unfolding and changing relationship, both in its circuit but also vertically in what you see, how far you get up off the water for the pier. That turned into a larger master plan, which starts to create a series of loops that connect out to other parts of the waterfront, even up to this one lake called Mirror Lake, so that the entire pier could be seen as eventually an extension of a larger formal structure of movement in the city. The other thing that the loop did, though, and most importantly, was to say that the water was the center of the project. The water was really what was at stake in this project. Here you see a map of a series of different itineraries that can take place. The project is meant to be both a circuit, but to also be an armature for many different types of activities. It's meant to be a place that you literally are able to walk out to the end of, to see the city, to be out over the water, for people to jog on, for people to run on, for bicyclists, for rollerbladers, to be that extension of quite literally a public park, but to also be the project that creates the opportunities for many different specific activities. Learning spaces, large amphitheater, commercial hub, beach and environmental energy producing islands that are part of the project. And this is, I think, one of the competing dilemmas in many social and public projects, especially in the United States, is the ambition to make these projects highly functionalized, extremely active, because I think that there's an enormous fear that if there isn't something to do in these spaces, somehow they won't be successful. There's a great anxiety and fear about that. But in a project like St. Petersburg, in many ways what's at stake is to put you into a stronger and more consequential relationship with the experience of quite literally being over the water. In a way, that, it feels like to us, should be almost the sole role of this project, to connect you to something that often is an experience that people don't get to have anymore. And that conflict and the back and forth between that, I think, is one of the characteristic parts of, as an architect, how do you begin to navigate the design process to find whatever that balance is between those two relationships. Here you see the center of that space where there is a marina for unpowered and small powered craft to be able to go out on a kayak, but really to create this bowl-like space, to create potentially this civic and inwardly looking space at the center of the project. There's an underwater garden, which is an estuary that Tom Leader, the landscape architect, is developing that is underwater but sits on the pilings of the old pier, so that there is in fact a landscape at the center, but one that is, I mean, quite literally in the water. The outside of the canopy is something that fewer people get to see, but the canopy as a whole starts to create a larger and very important civic overlook out to the water beyond that provides for the functional elements like shade to keep you out of the weather, but is also a place that you can climb up onto. So that while the project as a whole is about the larger civic or public entity in the city, there's also the possibility for smaller experiences, for more personal and singular experiences as you begin to climb up onto the shell with views out over the water and the bay. The last project I want to talk about is a project that Hitoshi mentioned. Hitoshi was involved in as a member of the advisory committee, which is a project in downtown Los Angeles, which is the remaking of the 6th Street Bridge. In Los Angeles, over the LA River, which is now, for the most part, a channelized storm channel. There are a series of bridges which were built closer to the turn of the 20th century by an engineer, Merrill Butler. And there are a series of them. This is the 4th Street Bridge, the 1st Street Bridge. This is the 6th Street Bridge as it exists now. Each of them having a very strong and very visible character in the city. And probably the 6th Street Bridge is one of the most iconic of all the bridges. It's the one that you see in many movies, you see in lots of films and commercials. The brief was to design a crossing, a bridge over the river that had the same level of visibility. But the reality is that there's a long viaduct that connects Boyle Heights with downtown, and that is just as much at stake. And the viaduct is very much what is as much as at stake in that connection across this entire former floodplain. The other thing that is a real part of the conversation about this project is infrastructure in general. I've been arguing for a while that this question of infrastructure in the city and how infrastructure starts to move from only doing one thing to an infrastructure that starts to take on multiple responsibilities is an ambition that as designers, as architects, landscape architects, urbanists, we need to continue to explore. This is a photograph from the book that I did a couple of years ago called No More Play, which is about these questions. This is an Iwan Bond photograph that I love because it's, in a very informal way, starts to create the sense of at least what some of those connections might be between infrastructure and landscape. The bridge that we've designed tries to take on those issues. One, to not create so much just a crossing at the river, but to literally take the entire 3,500 feet and to create an identifiable crossing that becomes as strong an image as the 6th Street Bridge was, the original 6th Street Bridge has been, but then also does more work to quite literally, of course, create the connection across from downtown to Boyle Heights, but also to begin to create stronger and more consequential connections to what's underneath the viaduct and the bridge, including the river, the Los Angeles River, which is continuing to be rehabilitated and developed Here you see the way that the bridge starts to create to the land banks, but also that there's the possibility of a pedestrian, a lower pedestrian bridge, so that during the floods, when the water is at its most extreme, at its most powerful, at its most intense, you're able to get in great proximity to the bridge. There are a series of urban connections that are very vital that the bridge right now just crosses over, including the Arts District and how strongly emerging that's becoming a river, obviously, but also the Industrial District, which is emerging as a green tech corridor in the city. This starts moving across with the space under the bridge at the Arts Plaza in the Arts District, which can be used as a very flexible type of civic space. It's also the place that you can get down to the river through the tunnel. You can see the train, which stays in the background. On the industrial side, the realignment of the bridge allows for the possibility of a new park, but also connections to all of these different businesses and industrial jobs that are very vibrant in this part of the city. And the way in which the bridge and the structure of the bridge starts to become something which enables and activates the relationship between this new park space through ramps and bicycle ways as well as pedestrian ways up to and down to that landscape. Again, a walkway up through the structure, so that the structure is something to both hold up the bridge but to quite literally produce and provide that access. And finally, you can climb all the way up to the top of the bridge, which is potentially an enjoyable thing to do. But I think really this image, I want to leave at this image, what I think this image does is talk about much more what, in terms of what's at stake with projects like this, at this scale. That architecture is very often about the form. Very much about something which is identifiable and singular and stands for something. Architecture represents. I still firmly believe that it has that capacity to do that many, many different ways. But at the same time, projects like the 6th Street Bridge or maybe the St. Petersburg Pier create their relationship to this sense of icon in a very different way. Not as something that's singular and is meant to be looked at, but that starts to become a framework or an armature or a way of a kind of observatory, that it allows for people to not just see the thing, but to see the city. I think too often people forget that projects that are always pointed to, like the Eiffel Tower, weren't first and foremost something to look at from the city, but were a way to get up and look out at the city, to not only see our present, but to potentially also see the future, to see what's emerging. I think that role for these projects to begin to be something that turns as much outward to the larger questions of what our role to these cities can become is fundamentally a way that I would like to see, certainly our practice, continue to emerge, to challenge those questions of architecture's role in relationship to these much larger social, political, and urban questions. Thank you.
Okay, is there any question from the audience?
It's too cold.
Okay, it's too cold, so.
Thank you. This was all very beautiful. And this certainly is. My question involves the codes and those wonderful steps fine for the vigorous and the young and the able-bodied. What about accessibility? Is there any way that same people that have the same great experience of seeing the city?
It is something that all through the design process we struggle with, because clearly that's an issue. If you're talking about trying to produce at both a conceptual level and also at a very real level, that level of accessibility, that absolutely becomes a question. What we've tried to do in the bridge is to provide for a series of overlapping multiple routes up and onto this thing. In some cases, for instance, like the hanging pedestrian bridge, where you can begin to see this accessibility and bicycle and pedestrian ramp that leads up through. Those occur. Those are quite literally accessible means, accessible routes, to achieve the same level of experience, different, but to achieve the same level of experience and accessibility as somebody who can walk up one of these stairs. Because the topography changes over the course of the bridge, it's also dependent on the topography. We're able to do that in certain parts of the bridge much more easily than we are in other parts. The thing that we wanted to try to stay away from was to produce a bridge and then attach a series of elevators to the bridge. Because in a way, that experience, I think, is just as isolating as not having that, because it's a non-public activity. So what we've tried to do is find the right balance. We're continuing to do that work. I'm not sure we exactly have it yet. But I think it's important to also understand that the stair, for instance, the stairs that lead up these arches of the bridge, they get you from the ground to the bridge. But we are also getting people down to the river, to the Arts Plaza, to this other much larger landscape. And there's a lot of work that's taking place at the whole ground plane that's as significant from an accessibility standpoint as the bridge itself. So it's going to be in the balance of that. It is going to be different. There are going to be places where I hope there will be stairs. There will be other places where there are ramps and other connections to the landscape. But I think this is really one of the challenges. Does that level of equality mean that every single moment of accessibility has to have equivalent accessibility in its location, or can that be more distributed across the entire project? That's a conversation that it's a code issue, but I also think it's a larger conversation when projects get to be this scale.
We have to discuss it already.
From the beginning, amongst ourselves and with the city, absolutely.
Okay.
As a recent graduate, say that you work but I have a question, just one question, I always want to ask. Why do you call it white?
What's the question?
Why the color white? It's a good question.
Why the color white?
I don't have a simple answer for that, so you're gonna have to, you asked the question, you're gonna have to bear with us. It is true that a lot of our work, my work, is white. And it's come from, it's born out of a number of thoughts about that. It started in a way because for a long time, my approach to the work has tended to be to create, in many ways, forms and spaces, relationships between the projects, in such a way that things like movement and choreography of movement is the way in which the intentions of the architecture, the qualities of the architecture, start to become understood, start to create an understanding of what's fundamentally at stake in the ideas of the project. I've also always been highly suspicious of materials. I have a great deal of ambivalence towards materials. Not because our projects aren't built, they are, not because we're not deeply invested in the construction and reality process of trying to make these things, but because I grew up as an architect believing that too often architects and architecture hangs its hope for visibility and strength and prominence on materials. That if the materials are intense enough, the architecture is strong too. And yet it very often deforms in the relationships. The spaces were secondary more than this was my own prejudice, total prejudice. Because of that, I started to look for ways in which material could, at one level, seem to take a back seat, but that took on other qualities for the project. And what I mean by that is that in projects, for instance, like Inner City Arts, which is a completely stucco building, or Pittman Dow, which is also stucco, but has many different refinements to the way in which the stucco, the different finishes, the different mixes, the colors in it. I was much more interested in the way that the environment, the context, reacted to that than trying to create, for instance, a strong material relationship to that context. There's a lot of, around Inner City Arts, all the buildings are made out of brick and concrete block. I didn't want to make that kind of immediate, make our building out of brick and concrete block and say, see if we relate to the neighborhood. What was fascinating was that the way that the light changed over time, the way it affected that surface. And I started to become much more interested in the depths of the surface and in surface in general, and the way in which it could produce qualities and impressions, as opposed to guiding you directly to the answer through the specificity of the material. I also think that there is, because of your ability to read into that abstraction, there's the ability for the individual to have their own reading of it, their own connection to it. At least that's what I'm hoping for. And in that, especially in projects like the Skid Row projects or the Inner City Arts project, your ability to project something into that and for it to change with you over the course of the day, I think it is a very possible. It has the potential to have a very strong impact. And if into that, in projects like Inner City Arts, they're able to read some level of optimism through that connection, that's a result that I'd be very happy to achieve. I don't know if that connects with your first question about hope, or in the beginnings, the question of hope, but I think in a way, that sense of the buildings in those